Hello and welcome to the Allplane Podcast, where we talk with interesting people that are redefining the future of commercial aviation. But first of all, and before I introduce today's guests, because today we have two guests, not just one, let me remind you that you can find all the previous episodes of this podcast as well as many other aviation stories on our website, Allplane.tv. That's Allplane.tv. Today we're going to talk about a topic that is appearing on this podcast, as well as in the media in general, with increasing frequency, and that's the absolutely fascinating world of advanced air mobility, what some media like to call flying taxis or flying cars, although there's a lot more than that. There is a wave of innovation that is coming from that corner of the aviation industry that promises to completely transform the way we move around cities and inside cities as well. How long before we hover around in all those electrically powered eVTOLs? What could the transition to this new era of air travel or advanced air mobility, to be more exact, look like? And how are different cities, regions, and countries preparing for that upcoming moment? On today's episode, Chris Fernando and Basil Yap are going to provide some expert perspective on all these matters. Chris and Basil are deeply involved in the American eVTOL scene. They are founding partners at Hovecon, a consultancy firm that aims to accelerate the adoption of autonomous aerial transportation technology, and they are also fellow podcasters running together the No U-Turn podcast about innovation in the transportation industry. In addition to these joint endeavors, they are each involved in a number of other projects and initiatives in the field of advanced air mobility. For example, Chris is a principal for aviation and emerging technologies at Quantitative Scientific Solutions, a big data firm, and a member of the Aeronautics Advisor Board at the Florida Institute of Technology, as well as an expert in residence at Advanced Mobility Collective, a nonprofit that promotes the adoption of advanced air mobility technology. And Basil is the president of AeroX, an organization that channels different initiatives aiming at developing an eVTOL technology ecosystem in the state of North Carolina. And he's the co-founder and general partner at AeroX Ventures, an early-stage venture fund focusing on advanced air mobility. So get ready for an in-depth review of the many interesting aspects of the advanced air mobility / eVTOL revolution with our two guests today, Chris and Basil.
Hi, Chris. Hey. Basil, how are you?
Hi, Mikhail. Good to finally connect. We've been talking about recording this episode for a bit, so good to finally connect. Where are you today? Where are you located?
Yeah, well, I'm located in a town near Barcelona on the coast, summertime. So the Allplane podcast is moving to summer quarters, and we're recording it from here.
I see.
Yeah, so that's why, if you hear the connection at some point breaking a little bit, is because it's not the usual connection. Hopefully it's all going to be fine. So I really wanted to have this chat with you guys because you are experts in a topic that I've been following quite a lot recently. And I have to say I come from a more, let's say, traditional commercial aviation background. But these last few months, eVTOLs are all the rage. Everyone is talking about eVTOLs, lots of action in this space, urban air mobility. We're seeing lots of SPACs, lots of new projects, new orders. And you guys, you both, Chris and Basil, you are experts in this field. You are co-hosts of the No U-Turn podcast about emerging technologies in transportation and mobility. You also work in several other projects like Hovecon, AeroX, and some others that we're going to discuss now in this particular field of advanced air mobility. So I would say, first of all, if you could please introduce yourself, and then we can go on and discuss more in depth all this interesting stuff that is happening in this area.
Sure. Again, thanks for the invite to be on your podcast. Very excited to chat about aviation and eVTOLs. My name is Chris Fernando. I'm actually based in Raleigh, North Carolina, but today I'm speaking to you from just outside Washington, D.C. My background is been in aviation for the past almost 20 years. I went to flight school in Melbourne, Florida. I had a dream of becoming a commercial pilot, like many in my family. But somewhere along the way in the late 90s, I changed my mind about flying and went into consulting after graduation. So I missed the flying some days, but it's helped me to kind of position myself in the industry. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I was in the right place at the right time, with all the unmanned aircraft systems research and now advanced air mobility, urban air mobility research that NASA was doing. So I got involved then with some of those projects, and here we are now. You're calling me an expert, but I don't see myself as an expert, but I think just by duration and time spent in the space, I know a little bit about this area, and I'm happy to share my thoughts.
I think he's selling himself a bit short. I think he certainly, you'll see from the conversation, I would define him as certainly one of the experts in this in this space.
I'm sure about that. Yeah.
So my name is Basil Yap, and again, like Chris, just excited to join you and talk about something that we're really passionate about and excited about, and that's aviation and the emerging technologies in aviation. I'm based out of North Carolina as well. I'm actually based out of a city called Winston-Salem. I started in civil engineering and worked around airport development, helping airports expand and maintain the infrastructure. And then had an opportunity to get into the UAS space as a state government in North Carolina Department of Transportation, and was able to lead a UAS program. How does the state as a state government view UAS, and how do they either regulate it or help the growth of it? And that's where I really got a lot of exciting experience. And started a consulting firm called Hovecon. And so through that, we've been able to work with state governments on some different projects, including a really exciting federal project around drone delivery. And also we're able to help with a eVTOL demonstration. So excited to share a little bit about our experience. Along the way, I met Chris. I've been fortunate to have that relationship, and we both decided to start a podcast as well and talk about some of these things, but excited to broaden that and talk with you today.
Mm-hmm. So the Hovecon, the firm you are both partners at, defines itself as it's a consultancy firm that specializes in promoting the adoption of eVTOL technologies.
Yeah, that's correct. So if I'm a state or local government here in the United States, and I'm thinking about this new mode of transportation, I want to understand how that impacts the community, what the use cases are, who's going to be using it. Is it going to be the hospital system, public safety, parcel delivery, or is it going to be, used for infrastructure inspection? And so our role is to kind of come in and help them with both of our respective experiences. Chris has a lot of great experience at the federal level. I have a lot of great experience at the state and local level, and we can share some of those lessons learned and prepare them for integrating this into their communities.
In addition to Hovecon, I've seen on your LinkedIn profile, you're also a partner at something called AeroX. Can you tell us about this? Is this also an eVTOL related venture?
Yeah, AeroX is a nonprofit, and so the city of Winston-Salem, which is a small, medium-sized city in North Carolina,
it's famous for being the place where the famous cigarette brand.
That's right. Yeah. So it really, a lot of the money associated with the development of the city is around tobacco. In North Carolina in general, a lot of the cities are, and so they kind of transitioned, of course, from all the money around tobacco to looking at other ways to diversify their economy. And in the past, Piedmont Airlines was founded there. Piedmont Airline went on to become, a really successful airline, eventually being sold to U.S. Airways. And there are a lot of aviation-focused individuals within the city. And so they saw this new emerging technology, UAS and eVTOLs, and they said, well, how can we really kind of be a test site or a example city, medium-sized city that would integrate these, again, eVTOL and UAS. And so they started a nonprofit to lead that particular effort. And so the nonprofit could work with on the commercial and private side, as well as on the government side. And so that's an initiative that we've started, and Chris helped support that as well.
And you, Chris, you are part of something called the Advanced Air Mobility Collective. What is that?
Yeah, so I think Basil is also part of that, but in a different role. So that's an organization, a nonprofit based out of North Carolina that is essentially bringing together many stakeholders, which include consultants, technologists, researchers, subject matter experts, to help be an entity that enables research and eventually policy development and implementation of all these emerging technologies, not just in aviation, but also surface transportation, wireless technologies, etc. So while we're based in Raleigh, North Carolina, there are nationally focused organizations. And currently, a lot of the focus of the organization is how we can use some of these new technologies to support disaster management. So think wildfires in Denver, Colorado, California. How can you use drones and these other technologies to help manage, fight, pre-post analyses? And then also there's a focus on healthcare. Mm-hmm. How can we use these new technologies to support healthcare operations? And I think Basil has some really good examples and use cases that have been in the works in North Carolina over the past 2+ years that he can get into.
Yeah, that would be certainly interesting to speak about, because there's a lot of hype about the world of eVTOLs. I would like to start by the very beginning. How is this industry organized? What different categories of eVTOLs are there? We are talking here, there are the ones that are unmanned. I don't know if it's technically correct to refer to them as drones. There are so many acronyms, and some of them are overlapping, I think. There's manned and unmanned, and then we have acronyms like UAS, UAM, AAM, eVTOL, ESTOL. How you guys think about this industry in terms of categories, groups?
Yeah, Basil, do you wanna start, and I'll augment, because this could be a podcast episode on its own.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah, great. So, the beginning of unmanned aircraft, it's interesting. If we look back at the history, as soon as we were flying aircraft, we think of the Wright brothers, flying right here actually in North Carolina, getting the first heavier than air powered flight taking place here. But, it wasn't long after that one of the Wright brothers actually partnered on an unmanned aircraft venture. So as soon as we started flying manned aircraft, we were taking the person out of it. Mm-hmm. And so over the years, we've been using unmanned aircraft for a variety of different reasons. During World War II, we were retrofitting existing aircraft to fly them either from the ground or from a trailing aircraft. And then, of course, through the Cold War, there was a lot of development. And really, on the hobbyist side, folks have always been flying what we would call remote control aircraft or RC aircraft. But the real kind of use of UAS or unmanned is associated with the commercialization that's happened probably in the last 20 or 15 years, where we began to see companies like DJI, and that was because of advancements in battery technology and motors and computer chips that could help manage the drone to fly. So unmanned aircraft is also associated with the use of military aircraft, and that was predominantly started in Desert Storm, but we saw a lot of use during the Afghan and Iraq campaigns as well. So yeah, that's kind of where the term UAS, and that's really focused around, I think we traditionally think of it as the smaller, they have SUAS, which just means small UAS, and then we have the larger UAS, and that's your traditional roles that you've seen. Large has been around the military applications, and SUAS has been around these hobbyist drones that folks are using them to take photos with, but also now we're seeing other use cases.
If I may stop you here 1 second, the U stands for unmanned.
Yep, that's right.
Air system, UAS.
Unmanned aircraft system. Yeah, and the system means it's not just the aircraft, it's also the controller, right? Because you're operating it from the ground now.
Yeah.
And so the system is the UAV, which is another acronym, unmanned aerial vehicle, and the ground control system. Yeah.
And the UCAS.
The UCAS.
That's another acronym, right? In the industry, more in the military side.
You mean CUAS?
Counter,
maybe.
CUAS. So that's a counter UAS.
Okay.
And that means actually detecting a drone, because we obviously we talk a lot about the good and beneficial use cases, but there are UAS being used obviously by bad actors. So then you want to be able to detect where those UAS are flying. Say you're at a baseball game or a football game, and now someone's flying a drone over the field. You want to know who's flying that drone, and how do you make sure that doesn't happen again? And we've seen a lot of that interest around airports, because we're seeing folks protest with flying drones near airports. So
in the UK there was I don't know if it was Heathrow or Gatwick. For almost a day, I think, because there's some unidentified object flying around. And UAS must not be mistaken for UAM, which stands for Urban Air Mobility. So that would be a similar acronym, but completely different meaning. Then you have eVTOL, so it's electric vertical takeoff and landing. And then you have eSTOL, electric short takeoff and landing, which would be another different type of craft. Just mentioning some of the acronyms that might come up here during the conversation. And
then AAM, advanced air mobility. That seems to be a term we're seeing. I don't know, Chris, we've seen that, I guess, in the last few years, that has become a more popular term.
Yeah, so I guess the UAM acronym came to be probably 4 or 5 years ago. NASA actually put out some studies or projects around urban air mobility and just trying to understand what this technology is. They had been researching this for, a good part of the past 15, 20 years. But the focus was, or the thought was, this will be an urban technology to help reduce congestion and improve kind of urban planning and how people move. But over the past, I think, 4 or 5 years, that has evolved as we learned about the various challenges of bringing this technology into an urban environment. Companies like Lilium and others started looking at a more regional air mobility. So now they have RAM, which is regional air mobility. And then you have, as Basil and both of you mentioned, you have the small US doing package deliveries. And there are smaller US that are also VTOL, vertical takeoff and landing. So I think NASA realized that without having all these different acronyms and verbiage to explain similar technologies, they kind of created this advanced air mobility umbrella, and all these technologies live under that umbrella, at least for the time being, till the next change comes along, I'm sure, in the next couple of years.
A new acronym.
Yeah.
And why all this action taking place now? As you mentioned, these type of technologies have been around in a more or less primitive form for quite a while. You mentioned World War II. I think the elder brother of JFK got killed in World War II in an accident over England.
Yep. They were packing these bombers full of explosives, and they were just flying them. What they would do is they would take off with the pilots on board, and then the pilots would jump out of the airplanes, with parachutes on, and it would be controlled from an aircraft that was following it. And unfortunately, there was an accident where JFK's brother was killed. There's actually another interesting story. Maybe I'll quickly tell, but
sure, go ahead.
There's the term drone is really first associated with a radio-controlled plane that was used as a trainer during World War II, and they would fly this trainer around in a field, and anti-aircraft gunners, whether they're going to be on a ship or on the ground, would practice trying to shoot down this remote control plane. So you'd have someone that would be flying it from the ground and just, buzzing it around. Well, it was so successful that they wanted to go take photos of the factory. And so they sent a photographer out to the factory, and there was a lady working there, and he was really impressed by her and said, you know what, you should go. He took quite a few pictures of her and said, he said, you should go to Hollywood and test as a model. And so she did. And crazy enough, we know her today as Marilyn Monroe. So Marilyn Monroe, before she was an actress and model, she was working in a factory helping put these first drones together. And it actually, there's even another connection because the photographer was from the first motion picture group in the Army, and the photographer's commanding officer, his name was Ronald Reagan, who would later become governor of California and then obviously president of the United States as well. So interesting connections.
Yeah, indeed. Actually, there's a book I read recently. I cannot recall the title now from memory, but I will post the link in the show notes. It's about all these technical and scientific experiments and other industrial activities that the US was doing during World War II. And I think there's a mention to Marilyn Monroe. I think Norma Jane, I think was her original name.
That's right.
About there's a mention in the book about her being a worker in one of these factories that was working for the war effort. So yeah, interesting story. This technology became all the rage in the last decade, more or less, when the general principles, the general ideas were already there for quite some time.
Yeah, so I think the catalyst was, again, as we've dealt with a lot of congestion on the surface, and companies like Uber, Lyft, and others have been trying to kind of find that edge in the market. Uber Elevate was formed, and they put out a white paper around this kind of idea that already existed, but they were kind of the first to start exploring this technology as a potential air taxi type of solution. But I would say that it's a combination of things, in my opinion. I think the advances in battery electric and battery technologies, there's still a long way to go. But that was one of the reasons that I think companies like Uber and others have started looking at this technology over the past several years. I think just computing technology and the ability to kind of the emergence of artificial intelligence to potentially have this autonomous technology in the airspace. And then, of course, there's been a lot of venture capital and investment from non-aviation entities. I mean, we know traditionally Airbus and Boeing, and there have been a handful of companies that have really led the R&D, but now you're seeing, companies like Google, Apple, and others, and their founders or former founders bringing their engineering and software background. So there are obviously positives, in my opinion, of them coming into this space. As we know, in traditional and protective of this space in a way, you have to have these certain criteria to enter the space. But now you're seeing all sorts of people in this space. So there are pros and cons to that. So I think it's not just one reason. I think NASA taking the leadership in this space also helped. And I think kind of the globalization of the world economy, and you see companies like EHang and others in Asia, and Lilium in Germany, Joby over here. And I think there are probably 200 plus aircraft OEMs or concepts, at least, in the mix. So at least that's my take on kind of why over the past 5 years, eVTOLs have kind of broken into the space. And I'll end by saying I think there's a place for this. I think as an aviation person, geek, whatever you want to call me, I do think that this will come to fruition. I think the timeline will be longer than people think. And I think the 200 plus aircraft concepts will come down to probably, a handful as they consolidate and figure things out. In different countries and regions.
Yeah, I got a bit the feeling that must have been something like this in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, when you had all these people that were starting aircraft companies just out of nowhere. Same with car companies, like car makers, aircraft makers. If you had a bit of a creative guy, entrepreneurial guy, you could start, a car maker or an aircraft maker with relatively little capital and test new ideas. And then all of those were basically ended up being like the 2 or 3 we have today. So,
right.
So I guess, maybe there's a parallel there. The big question is what's going to be the final structure of this industry. And here I wanted to ask you about the ecosystem. What does it take to have a successful eVTOL ecosystem or a successful advanced air mobility ecosystem? I mean, you guys have been working in North Carolina with people there. You have seen things from multiple sides. So what would be your view on this? And where do all the other players fit into this picture, like the airports, the industrial supply chains, the regulators?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's certainly a lot of players to ensure that this concept and ecosystem is going to thrive. A lot of the conversations have started around the movement of passengers and with eVTOLs. So Chris mentioned Uber having a strong interest in how to move passengers within urban areas. So that's one kind of, if we just take that use case as an example, I think we can talk through. So for one, you're going to need, you starting at the aircraft, we have the aircraft regulators, and we need to ensure that we can have certified aircraft that fly in the airspace above us. And so the civil aviation authorities of obviously each respective country is going to need to have some type of certification and oversight process. And so in the US, of course, that's the FAA, or the Federal Aviation Administration. And right now we have multiple eVTOLs going through a certification process. And of course, it's totally new, totally new to them. If we're going to be using an electrical system, that it doesn't act like a helicopter, but it's battery powered, and it's going to fly in the same airspace as our traditional aviation. There's a lot to figure out, and we don't have a certified aircraft yet. We're hoping maybe the next year or 2 years we'll have a certified aircraft, which includes a production certification so they can start producing them and selling them. So that regulator around the aircraft certification, as well as a regulator of the airspace. So how do we integrate this eVTOLs into our existing air traffic control system? And then is there a localized air traffic control systems like within a city, whether that's LA or a New York, right? If we have multiple eVTOLs flying around, they need to talk to each other. So that's the kind of the role of the Civil Aviation Authority. And then at a local level, we're going to, of course, have the folks that are going to own where the aircraft take off and land, and ensure that they're connected to the rest of the transportation systems within that area. So you're going to want to have what we would call a vertiport, which is like a helipad. You think of a traditional helicopter as a vertiport, where eVTOLs are going to land and be recharged and take passengers and offload passengers. And those need to be near, obviously areas of interest, whether that's near stadiums or other shopping areas or office areas, or connected to the next mode of transportation, whether that's micromobility like scooters or bikes, pedestrian walkways, or ride sharing, or even, rail, light rail or metro. So, traditionally that's a role of like a local government that helps with that, but there's been talk about even that being a private or commercial entity that would own that vertiport. And so that's another important segment of this. And then we have the operators, the folks that are actually going to be operating these, obviously for profit. So could be, an Uber, or it could also be an American Airlines or another company that we haven't heard of that would actually be operating this, hiring the pilots in the beginning, but also having the software that would ensure folks can buy tickets and get on there and manage the operations.
Yeah.
So those are three I mentioned there: the regulator, right? The folks that are going to own the infrastructure, and then the operator. I know there's more, so maybe I'll throw it over to Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Basil. So there are tons of challenges in getting some of these things literally and figuratively off the ground. And so on the air taxi side, two of the markets that have been talked about at length is airport shuttles. So that would be an easier connection using existing potential infrastructure like heliports, convert them to vertiports. There are challenges with that. And then take them to an airport from a downtown environment, seeing that the airport also has existing infrastructure that can be leveraged. So the airport shuttle market seemed like an early market that could be that could come to fruition once these aircraft are certified and in operation. And then there's Air Metro, which is a little more of a scheduled service that has also been discussed. But that was probably a couple of years ago. And of course, I think that's still a focus of many of the OEMs and ecosystem. But I think more recently, everyone in the industry is realizing that operating these things, converting heliports, building infrastructure, a huge amount of investment, taxpayer money as well, and absorbing huge risk from state and local entities will have to take place. So I think over the past couple of years, the markets that are being looked at have become more kind of humanitarian, life-saving type markets like healthcare. How can drones be used for healthcare or unmanned systems? How can eVTOLs be used for healthcare? Because that'll be an easier pathway potentially for public acceptance of this aircraft, because I cannot imagine people will be too happy to have these aircraft landing in people's backyards, flying amongst buildings, weather and noise and other things that have to be overcome. So just to kind of wrap this piece up, I think the markets have changed from moving people to more moving cargo, air ambulance, healthcare deliveries. So you're going to see this kind of shift happen, and then probably air taxi come back once the technology has been put out.
That was actually one of the things I had here in my notes to ask you is what's going to come first, if passengers or cargo, and how you see these two markets evolving. We have seen a couple of big deals in the cargo market in the last week in the electric aircraft space. And also in a recent podcast, in the Aftalk podcast, a few days ago, they had as a guest the editorial director of eVTOL.com, Elon Head, and they were talking about the restrictions that might be in place, at least in the early stages where people are not used to this type of aircraft. People might object to all this craft moving overhead and landing in people's backyards and stuff like that. So that might be restricting a little bit the use cases. How many of these things are going to be flying overhead at any one time? That's a big thing. I don't know. I don't think people are yet psychologically prepared to see many things buzzing overhead all the time. What do you think?
To me, noise, I think to a certain extent, technology will solve for it, but it all depends on how many aircraft are in the sky. Noise is not linear, it's logarithmic. So, noise is going to increase as you add aircraft, but it can also be offset by how you design your cities and what the weather is and different other variables. So I think visual pollution is something that people are not thinking about. If you have a lot of these aircraft flying in the sky at low altitude, ruin your views in national parks or state parks, or people just trying to relax. So that's something that people don't think about really at this stage. And also, I think there are concerns that this technology is being developed for the rich and famous, and the only people who will have access to this is, the 1% of the 1%. And so, why should taxpayers invest taxpayer money and provide infrastructure in urban areas and, other more rural areas if the only people who are going to use them and access them are the rich and famous? So I think, to me, that's a bigger problem, because I think there are a lot of companies who say the right things, who are saying this technology will be accessible to all, but in reality, we know that that is not a priority at this time. And so one of the things that we like to focus on, not just on our podcast, but the work we do, is to make people, not just aware, but work through these challenges to make sure that accessibility and equity are a focus of some of these companies and potential operators. I do think if I were to pick one challenge outside of the public social acceptance, which I 100% agree with you that will be a problem, I think weather will be the biggest challenge to overcome. Mm-hmm. A lot of these aircraft don't have a AC. So imagine getting into these aircraft in Miami or Arizona, or the battery life in Alaska or somewhere where it's really cold. And the wind patterns changing in New York City and Chicago. So, and then this could kind of reduce the operational window, right, on a daily basis. So I think whether if I were to pick one challenge that many companies will have, if not all, unless it's a very specific geographic location, will be weather. And that's what will drive kind of the use cases as well.
The one thing, I haven't thought that much about the weather, but the one thing that I'm thinking about is all the air traffic control that you mentioned earlier, because obviously if you have all these things flying, at some point one of them is going to fall down from the sky, and that might be a big thing, right? So just as the beginning, when there were cars at the beginning of the 20th century, there were no traffic lights, there were no indications, there were no zebra crossings, stuff like that. You could just drive wherever you wanted, wherever you could physically, because obviously there were not as many roads. But in this case, I guess at some point in congested areas, there will have to be some new ways to organize all this traffic, because otherwise it's going to be a bit of a chaos overhead. And people then would complain, and obviously that's a safety risk for people on the ground as well. I don't know. One of the use cases I see promising is in the regional space, in places like remote communities, where I see a potential use. But these remote communities normally they are located in places with some extreme weather, like Alaska or northern Scandinavia, places like that. If the manufacturers deliver on the costs, on the operating costs they promise, they could be an interesting alternative to land transport. I don't know, that regional case could be an interesting thing to see how it evolves.
And that's where I think we mentioned an acronym eVTOL, which is electric short takeoff or landing. I think that's really a place. The range of an eVTOL is going to be much further than an eVTOL. Mm-hmm. And so if there's a fixed wing capacity that it transitions, we know all your energy is spent. There's a lot more energy being spent in a hover, and so the quicker you can transition into fixed wing flight, which is going to be the most efficient flight for electric motors, well, it's just going to be the most efficient, then you'll see the greatest ranges. So I do think there's some exciting work by folks like Electra and others that have electric powered aircraft, eVTOL, and they can take off and land shorter distances, because they're essentially pushing the air over by the prop versus it flying and going through the air. So it's just has lower stall speeds and can take off quicker. So I think there's tremendous potential there in the regional market.
And Basil, do you want to touch on some of the drone deliveries that have been going on in North Carolina? Because I really think that those packaged medical applications can be, expanded and extended into these rural environments to provide, by using eVTOLs and eVTOLs, not just in Alaska and places like that, but even in places like North Carolina, where there are quite large rural areas.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you about the North Carolina experience, because usually when people talk about these eVTOLs, people think about super huge cities like New York, Chicago, Dubai. But what about communities of a smaller size? Obviously, there are some decently sized cities in North Carolina, but a much smaller scale. Like, what's your experience, and what sort of use cases are you working on in the North Carolina case?
Yeah, great question and great observation. We obviously hear a lot about LA and New York and other areas, and it's because with these eVTOLs for passenger delivery, they need a lot of turnover. They need a lot of flights to be able to kind of recover the cost. But those cities also come with a lot of restrictions and a lot more bureaucracy in the government, right, to work through. So they're not, I guess, in my opinion, the best places to test these new technologies out. You need kind of smaller areas to prove out the concept, and then you can scale it to larger areas. And so that's kind of been our focus in North Carolina around how do we integrate, starting with drones or UAS, and then now eVTOLs or eSTOL aircraft. And one of the early use cases, which we focused on, was medical package delivery. And, Amazon has been talking about package delivery since the early 2000s, but the first commercial drone delivery operation under a section, what we call Part 135, it was the real true drone delivery regulations that are in place, was for a medical use case. And so I'll mention a couple of these use cases we have in North Carolina, and then kind of the potential for eVTOLs. Our healthcare system in the US kind of becoming more centralized. And so the rural areas of our state, folks are driving into kind of these central locations or large urban areas for their healthcare needs, including specialty doctors, whether it's oncology for cancer or other things. And the idea was to use drones to deliver critical supplies within that network. And so the first kind of step in that direction was delivering supplies within a campus, within a hospital campus. And so in Raleigh, we're working with a company or with a healthcare system, Wake Med, and they are delivering blood specimens. So you get your blood drawn at a clinic, and then they put it on a drone and it flies to a central location at the hospital, and that lab tests the blood, and then it gives you the results. And so when you duplicate that over an entire network, all of those outlying clinics can now be using drones to fly the blood in, and the turnaround for the testing is quicker, because traditionally it takes someone in a van to drive to all those different locations, pick the blood up, and then they drop it all off at once. And maybe they'll do that twice a day. But now you can get your results much quicker, and that helps. And then on, flying from the central location, the hospital or the pharmacy, you can put, prescription drugs or other critical supplies to fly it out to those outlying clinics. It could be anti-venom for a snake bite, or it could just be a specialty medicine required. And that's similar to what we're doing with another healthcare system, Wake Forest Baptist in Winston-Salem. They're actually mixing an infusion for cancer patients at their pharmacy, and then they're putting it on a drone and flying it out to an infusion center where it's then given to the patient. And then another company, Zipline, is working with Novant, delivering critical supplies like PPE in response to COVID. And another company delivering vaccines, Merck, and they're the pharmaceutical company, uses Valancy. So we're fortunate to have all of those operations in North Carolina, but in those cases, we're just delivering small items like blood specimens and pharmaceutical items, as well as PPE. But think about it now, if we could put a doctor on one of these. And so you could fly a doctor out to a rural community, and they could meet with individuals in that area, or they could fly out for a surgery, go to a surgical center, and they're an expert, and they could be centrally located. And that's where we see a lot of potential with eVTOLs. We've also looked at, flying patients from those rural areas to the hospital. We found out that a lot of the helicopter medevac flights that take place are between hospital. They're hospital transfers. So someone comes into a hospital in a rural area, and they might not have enough beds, or they don't have a specialty doctor to take care of that individual, or they don't have the equipment for that particular diagnosis. They put them on a helicopter and they fly them to a main hospital. And I think the numbers are around like 70% of the folks that are flown in on a medevac helicopter actually walk out the same day. And so that's just, pretty amazing. So the medical use case is really interesting. Last thing I'll mention is because the communities can get behind using drones and eVTOLs for that reason. It's kind of like why we pull to the side of the road when we see an ambulance go down, right? We know that could be us in that eVTOL in the future, and we know it's potentially saving someone's life, and that's a little bit easier to get folks behind versus delivering goods or pizzas or something else to your neighbors or to your front step.
Yeah.
And so we found a lot of traction there.
What about the air traffic control issues that we were mentioning earlier? How are the local state authority? I don't know if they have any authority on that, but are you working on that also at the state level in these trials you're doing there?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so you mentioned, do the state and local have a role? And they do have a role, but there's a lot of questions about, who manages low altitude airspace. And we could have a whole podcast. I mean, there's been books written about this. Traditionally, the Federal Aviation Administration manages all of the airspace that we fly in. But now, we're flying at such low altitudes with drones. A lot of these concepts are coming into question. And so the management right now of it is in close coordination with the FAA, which also oversees the air traffic control in and out of airports. And so the specific routes are being approved by the Federal Aviation Administration. And then in some cases, we'll share through a notice to airmen, just so others that are flying in that area are aware that these flights are taking place. But we do a study of the airspace, so we ensure that we're not on the approach path for any of the airports, and we're staying clear of helipads. In the case of the hospitals, they of course have helipads for medevac helicopters to come in and land, and so we coordinate with the scheduler for those helicopter flights, and we can ensure that if a helicopter comes in while they're flying a drone, we can either land the drone or if a helicopter's inbound, we just don't take the drone off. So at a very small scale, we're looking at, we're managing that. But the state of North Carolina has put together a concept of operation to help manage those throughout the entire state through a network of sensors. And we're seeing other states do this too. But at the end of the day, just like our roads or our airports or our rail corridors, we just need to have a way that you can recover the cost of operating that infrastructure. And so the idea around fees for that use is not very popular, but we have airport landing fees, we have fuel tax, we have other ways that we fund our infrastructure. So those are some of the difficult conversations we're going to have in the future.
I'll just add, Mikhail, the other states that are outside of North Carolina are looking at doing some of this testing and evaluation that is required through the development of these corridors. So New York has a corridor of 50 miles that include Syracuse Airport, the Griffiths Test Site, and some universities, hospitals, DoD entities. The state of Ohio has a corridor that is focused on, I think, Route 33 to do these types of research in partnership with the Air Force. North Dakota has a 50-mile corridor. So we're seeing different states develop or create these spaces so that we can actually do the research and the testing and deliveries to really understand how we can create that bigger system that Basil was talking about.
And what about this network of sensors that you mentioned? How does it work? Are those located on the ground, I guess, in specific areas? But how do they work in practical terms?
Yeah, great question. So, we have radar already. Typically, they're located at our airports, or we have what's called en route radar, so that anytime, folks are flying within our national airspace, we have visibility of them. Of course, that's only at certain altitudes. And that's, I guess, the issue is we don't have good visibility at low levels, just because the way the radars work, they're not pointing down. And so those sensors that we're looking at would be radar that would face down or to the horizon and get a better visibility of low altitudes. And you would want to place those. There's been concepts and ideas of placing those on cell towers or tall buildings. And so when we look at Winston-Salem, we've located a couple tall buildings that we can put these sensors on and face them in the directions that we're interested. And that's primarily used to pick up where what we'd call non-cooperative aircraft are flying. So in the US, you can actually get in, a Piper Cub aircraft that may or may not have an electrical system. You can fly around in an airspace designated as Class G. It's called uncontrolled. And you don't have to talk to anybody as long as you can see out the window and make sure you don't run into the ground or into anyone else. And then we have other folks that are flying at low altitudes, like helicopter operators, looking at maybe power lines or medevac or public safety for law enforcement or firefighting. And so that's the idea of that surveillance sensor. And then you'd have sensors, for folks to pick up like a transponder, or the future kind of transponder for drones, which is called remote ID. And then the sensors for our communication links to ensure that there's a strong communication link between the ground station and the eVTOLs or UAS flying in that airspace. So that's the network, and it's all kind of called a UTM, and there's another acronym for you, unmanned traffic management, so a UTM system.
Mm-hmm. You've worked a lot with airports. What do airports need to do in order to be able to integrate with all these potentially new networks? We have seen airlines like United and others investing in this space to connect with their longer haul air operations. How do you see this integrating all together? The airports, the airlines that fly the traditional aircraft, plus the eVTOLs that might do transfers to and from the airport, and maybe some other use cases. What does an airport need to do? What sort of infrastructure needs the airport need to have? What sort of investments, and how all these different parts and pieces can work together? Also at the level of terminals, if you get people moving from arriving in an eVTOL and then transferring to an A320 and a 737, for example, what's the state of the art thinking in this area?
Yeah, so I can start here. I'll rattle off a bunch of things, and then Basil can chime in. Security is going to be a big deal. I think the last use case or process you described, where is TSA, for example? How will they be implemented? Will it be just technology, or will there be people? How are people going to be checked? Where will they be checked? So I think security at airports for mobility solutions like this will be huge. And as parking has always been one of the largest, if not the largest, revenue generator for most airports. And if people stop driving and parking, how is that infrastructure going to be converted and used? So I think, it's not easy to convert these infrastructure. And if airports are looking to build new infrastructure, they need to start thinking about how to future-proof some of these infrastructures so that they can be used for or become a vertiport. And that means charging these aircraft rapidly. So having almost a separate grid, or the use of microgrids to, charge up these aircraft. And this applies to, autonomous vehicles on the ground as well. So it'll be a combination of a vertiport for aircraft and something on the ground as well. So to me, on the infrastructure side, there are a lot of things that have to be addressed. The airspace side actually kind of, even though it exists, I think for the most part, can be solved in the near term as long as the scale is not huge in terms of operations. But I think having to figure out where these aircraft actually land, whether they land airside or landside, will there be another shuttle to take them from the eVTOL to the airport, actually save time, or will it actually increase time of the total trip? Those things kind of come to mind. And then also, the how people intend to use them. I mean, we've not really touched on the autonomous side of things, or when these things will become autonomous. We expect initial operations to have a pilot, some sort of pilot, maybe not a pilot in the traditional sense, but somewhat of an operator who kind of manages the aircraft, kind of supports any type of emergency. But to me, the infrastructure piece at the airport side will have to be solved sooner rather than later, because it's very difficult plan for, as you know, airports do master plans and they go out 15, 20 years, and then someone wants a vertiport put in the next 2 or 3 years. It's very hard to, from a funding standpoint, project standpoint, to integrate. So I don't know, Basil, what do you think?
You really did a great job covering a lot of the elements that we'd look at. We're fortunate to be working with airports right now on the master planning effort and other efforts to integrate both UAS and eVTOLs into their operations. And the other kind of element I'll mention is the users. So if you're hypothetically a company like parcel delivery company like UPS or DHL or FedEx or even Amazon in the future, you may be flying things on a traditional aircraft, and then from the airport using an eVTOL or an eSTOL to fly to your distribution center for maybe particularly critical items that need to be delivered within 12 hours or even quicker. And so we're going to see a lot of the use cases driven by some of these big operators that already are helping with the revenue on airports.
Sorry, one question I have here is, in quantitative terms, how big could this be? Because I'm thinking, and particularly when thinking about passenger transport, for example, the cargo, obviously, there are some cargoes that are more valuable than others. But when you're thinking passengers, I'm guessing if airlines want to integrate this into their operations, it would need to be for the highest premium passengers, at least in large airports, because after all, even a large airport has a limited amount of airspace that can be used, but those craft are normally quite small. So how many of those craft, even if you are constantly operating them 24/7, how many people is that? I guess in a small regional airport, like as we were saying in Alaska, for example, you can get a significant portion of the passengers connecting this way. But at JFK or Newark or O'Hare or some large airport, even if you are operating thousands of these, it's going to just be a fraction of the amount of people that go through the airport in any given day.
Which is why I don't think this technology will reduce congestion on the streets. But that's for another episode.
Yeah.
So if we think about how folks get to the airport, right now, so often they're being driven to the airport, right? It might be a ride share, Uber, Lyft, or some other form of transportation dropping them off. And it's typically one or two people in that vehicle. And so now you would take a portion of those folks arriving in those vehicles. And again, eVTOLs could be 2 to 4 passengers arriving at a time. So I think that, the demand will be driven by, like you said, probably the premium ticket holders if the airline is going to incorporate it in. And this is not a new concept. You used to be able to buy an airline ticket to fly out of any of the New York airports. And there was a part of the ticket was that you would get a helicopter ride from downtown New York to the airport. So this is a similar concept that potentially could be applied to eVTOLs as well.
In those cases, you also would need a clear delimitation of the airspace and create some sort of corridor for people to, like a constant line of eVTOLs dropping people off, picking up other people, something like the taxi line you get outside of airports, something like that.
There have been some modeling. NASA did some modeling out at, I think it was Dallas Fort Worth. Correct me, Chris, if I'm incorrect, but I think it was with Uber. I think some of that data is public where they were trying to figure out exactly what you're asking. How do we coordinate getting eVTOLs between the two main runways, and what does that interaction with air traffic control look like?
And what was the result? Did they come up with some ideas?
Well, I believe they came up with a system in place that could help manage the traffic based on the location of their flights and how they would deconflict with the parallel runways. So essentially they were flying in kind of right over where the main traffic was coming in and minimized crossing over runways or being any approach paths.
And where do you see this technology taking off, literally, sooner, in the US or worldwide? I mean, we have seen some communities, some jurisdictions seem to be more keen on experimenting and advancing in this direction. Where do you see this happening first?
Well, I think the first flights I don't think, unfortunately, that the US will be the first to market, just because of the regulatory environment. The standard and the bar is to achieve is quite high, which is not necessarily a bad thing. But I think the US is becoming the proving ground and the test bed for a lot of these OEMs to operate, manufacture, and then operate these aircraft in other countries. So I think China will likely be first to market with EHang. I think the Middle East is also likely one of the first regions to operate these. Dubai is looking at several different applications of not just eVTOLs, but also the smaller drones by public safety entities like the police, but also to move passengers and cargo. So I think if I were to pick two early entrants in terms of regions, it's probably those two. I think there's quite a bit of application in the continent of Africa that could be leveraged and unlocked. And then island communities, like connecting different islands in the Caribbean and Latin America, or Hawaii, where there are archipelagos of islands. And even in Southeast Asia, connecting Singapore, Malaysia, the islands in Indonesia. I think those, to me, will likely be the markets that not only can operate, but also scale much faster than in the US. And I always kind of equate how cell phones, went from landlines to actually having cell phones. And many of the countries that were able to adopt that technology were countries in the developing part of the world. And it came to places like the US and some communities much later, because we had a much more mature infrastructure. Whereas you're in a village and you go from no phone to having an iPhone 10. Yeah. So I think the similar thing will happen with this technology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was surprised to learn in the latest press release announcing a deal by Eve, the Embraer eVTOL arm, that was saying that 6 out of the 10 largest urban helicopter markets in the world are in Latin America. Surprised to learn that. I knew that Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, for example, were big markets, but it's apparently a whole regional thing.
Colombia, there's a lot of congestion, and I think for them, a rural trip, and this is based on conversations we've had with folks like our own vehicles in Colombia, their rural trip is considered to be like 1 to 3 miles. And it takes them like an hour and a half to go the distance on the ground. Yeah. So if that is the distance you have to travel, and you can develop the infrastructure, that's going to save not just time, but money and make things, especially in emergencies, getting police and public safety. So I think that is kind of one of the primary reasons that the rural in the US is much longer distances, whereas in those communities, rural is a very short distance, and that could be a really good market for entry, but also to scale.
Mm-hmm. So just to wrap it up, what do you see, apart from the regions, in terms of technology and development, what do you see happening the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years in this field? Are we finally going to have the quote-unquote flying taxis that we've been promised for so long? Or that's going to be restricted for now to the drone delivery of parcels and medical supplies and the like?
I think, yes, there will be. I think you're going to see Joby and others operating in the next 2 to 3 years. But I think it will be a taxi where you're moving people at scale. We're probably 10 plus years away from that. But I do see these aircraft being used by people who can afford them in the short term, but then also for cargo and healthcare applications. So I'm optimistic, very optimistic, that this technology will come to fruition over the next 2-3 years, maybe 5 years. But scaling, we're probably 15, 20 years, 10 to 20 years out from that, in my opinion. I know, Basil, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'm thinking along the same lines as you. We got to get aircraft certified, like I mentioned earlier. So getting an eVTOL certified just helps someone like an FAA or regulators be comfortable with that process, because you work a lot out when you get an aircraft certified when it comes to processes. So we got to get the first one through that hurdle, and then we'll see more. And I do think we'll see the use cases around cargo, and within cargo could be a subset of medical delivery, medical package delivery, as some of the first use cases we see. UPS obviously made an investment in purchasing some beta aircraft. We've seen United Therapeutics as well, working with beta aircraft around their healthcare support. There's some use cases we haven't, really touched on. I can see eVTOLs flying and moving cargo either out to wind farms or out to the platforms, oil platforms in the Gulf. I think there's a lot of use cases that minimize the impact while we build ours on these platforms, and then eventually put folks on them. I do think the military, we're seeing a lot of investment by the military, and so I think the military will be flying air taxi like aircraft in the next 2 to 3 years as well, and so that we'll learn a lot from them as well.
Great point.
Interesting panorama where lots of things are happening, so that people can keep up to date with everything that's going on in this space. Which social media channels, websites, podcasts would you direct them to? What's the address of your podcast and the other projects you are active in at the moment?
Sure. Well, Chris and I are both part of the No U-Turn podcast. You can look that up on Spotify or whoever you use, Pandora, for your podcast needs. And No U-Turn again is focused kind of on broader technology and emerging technologies around transportation. You also mentioned the nonprofit AeroX. That's ncaerox.com, NCAEROX.com, and then of course our consulting firm Hovecon, HOVECON.com are some places to start. Chris, what are your recommendations for kind of all things AAM or UAM?
Well, the Dawn of Drones by Don Zoldi, who's a expert in the legal and regulatory front on unmanned systems, would be a good one. I think that's the name of her podcast that is attracting a lot of speakers in our ecosystem. But there are not too many. One of the reasons we started ours was there were not too many podcasts that we were aware of. I'm sure there are a few that we're not aware of that kind of focused on kind of emerging trends and technologies. So shout out to our co-host Ravi Singh. Don't want to forget him. He's part of the three hosts. So those are kind of the two that I'm aware of, ours and then of course yours, Allplane, Dawn of Drones or Drones of Dawn. I'm gonna have to check.
I'll check it out, and I will add links to all these resources in the show notes so that people can follow you. And
then you mentioned eVTOL, the organization that puts out a lot of articles.
Yeah.
Also, the Vertical Flight Society, they don't have a podcast, but they have a lot of resources available on this topic area for the community for free at times, but also if you're willing to become a member, then they have more information.
Indeed, yeah. Very well. It's been a very interesting chat. I'll definitely keep an eye on all these projects you guys involved in. And it would be great to have you back on the show at some point in the future and see how things have been moving along and where are we in this eVTOL revolution that is unfolding as we
Thank you so much for having us. We want to reciprocate and have you on as well. Season 2 for us starts in a couple of weeks. So we'd love to bring you on and talk about Europe and things happening in Spain and the writing you do, because I know that's a focus area as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation. Let's talk about when that can happen. But in the meantime, thank you very much.
Thanks, Miguel.
Thank you.
Before you go, and if you like this podcast, a quick reminder that it would be absolutely great if you could please give it a rating on Apple, Spotify, or whichever platform you're using, or recommend it to a friend or whomever might be interested. Thank you very much and see you soon.